In 1994, game designer Shinji Mikami began working on a new IP for Capcom's push into the 32-bit era. Mikami had spent most of his career creating licensed video games for Disney, and wanted to try and create something new and much more adult. His biggest inspiration came from games like Alone in the Dark and Capcom's own Sweet Home, both of which we discussed in part 1. But his biggest inspiration came from a series of movies that George Romero had created. These, of course, were the Of the Dead series. As this game was being developed, upper management at Capcom started to realize what it was that they actually had here, so they started to push it to be the flagship game for the new Sony PlayStation console. With a fucking fast 3D GPU and the use of compact discs, there was no doubt that this system was perfect for handling this game. And in 1996, after months of delays, Biohazard, or Resident Evil, was finally released.
It was Bravo Team's helicopter. Nobody was in it. But strangely, most of the equipment was still there. However, we soon discovered why.
The game itself lets you play as either Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine, who are both members of the police task force named STARS, who is tasked with investigating a series of violent attacks that can be led back to the Spencer Mansion, which is outside the town of Raccoon City. While investigating, the team discovers the mansion is infested with zombies. Resident Evil changed fucking everything. The graphics were superior to most of the games that had been out at the time. The mechanics of the game helped build the horror, while still keeping you involved and engaged. Spencer Mansion itself is one of the most brilliantly designed maps in all of gaming history. Resident Evil gathered rave reviews upon its launch, and it helped solidify Capcom's future as being one of the biggest developers for the PlayStation. It would go on to see ports on the Sega Saturn and PC. It would also get a director's cut the next year, which expanded upon the game itself. In 1998, Resident Evil 2 was released on the PlayStation. It would later be ported over to the PC and, of course, to the Nintendo 64, which is where I first fucking played it. In fact, this was the first horror game that I have ever actually played. And believe me, I played the shit out of this game. In this sequel, we are taken out of the mansion and thrown into the streets of Raccoon City as a small-scale zombie apocalypse hits the fucking town. The maps, the graphics, and the violence, of course, were all amped up as you make your way through the city trying to escape. In lieu of the hilariously active FMV scenes, we now had beautiful pre-rendered cutscenes.
Wait! Don't shoot!
Get down! We can't stay out here. Head to the police station. It'll be a lot safer.
To this very day, Resident Evil 2 is still considered by many to be the best in the franchise's history. By the late 90s, many companies were putting out their own horror games. Everything from Parasite Eve, Half-Life, and System Shock were all coming out and gaining huge amounts of praises from the audiences. Capcom was continuing to ride on the success of Resident Evil by pushing out 3 more Resident Evil sequels before the end of the decade. In 1999, Capcom also released a new horror-themed IP called Dino Crisis. This game was pretty much a clone of the Resident Evil mechanics, just with dinosaurs instead of zombies. The game itself was pretty good, but it was starting to become clear that these survival horror games were starting to leave the horror side and become much more action-based. But Konami had an answer to this. In 1999, while still reeling in the success of Metal Gear Solid, which came out a year earlier, they took a chance on an atmospheric horror game made by a small-time developer. This is, of course, Silent Hill. In this game, Harry Mason and his daughter get into a car accident while they're on their way to the town of Silent Hill. When he wakes up, he realizes his daughter is gone. In pursuit of her, he discovers that the town is full of horrifying creatures. He would eventually stumble upon a conspiracy in the town involving his daughter. While the game still played like its Capcom counterparts, it was also nothing like it. Instead of going with an action hero style protagonist, you play someone who's probably never even held a fucking gun in his life. Instead of going with 100 fucking jump scares, Silent Hill scares you through disturbing imagery and slow, creepy gameplay. When Silent Hill was first released, it did not hit anywhere close to the levels of financial success that Resident Evil had seen, but it did receive a large amount of praise from critics and players alike. Because of this, Konami immediately greenlit a sequel, which was released on the PlayStation 2 in 2001.
After we got separated in that long hallway? Are you confusing me with someone else? You were always so forgetful. Remember that time in the hotel?
Maria?
You said you took everything, but you forgot that videotape we made. I wonder if it's still there.
How do you know about that? Aren't you Maria?
Silent Hill 2 is a fucking masterpiece, and it is still praised by many as being one of the greatest horror games ever fucking made. The story is extremely strong, the scares are so disturbing that some people find it hard to even play through it, and the twist ending will have you conflicted about our protagonist. The game was a huge financial and critical success. Silent Hill 2 would end up leading the way into the 6th generation of consoles. Fatal Frame, which also came out in 2001, follows Miku as she searches for her brother in a haunted mansion. The only weapon she has is a camera, which can be used to exorcise the spirits that she meets. This game is pretty fucking scary. In fact, the developers had to tone down the actual horror of the game so that players wouldn't stop playing it. While these games were coming out on the PlayStation 2, Nintendo was also trying to take their own approach to horror. And of course, with it being Nintendo, they took a kid-friendly approach with the release of Luigi's Mansion in 2001. This game has you play Luigi, who is also searching for his brother Mario, in another haunted mansion. Instead of wielding a camera, he has a flashlight and a vacuum cleaner. While not necessarily scary, this game is fun as shit to play. To this day, it is probably my favorite Mario Universe game. Over the next couple of years, Nintendo would start picking up Resident Evil games. This started with a remake of the original game, and this version is definitely the definitive version of the game. Hell, it was even used for the HD remaster that was released towards the end of last year. The other one that came out that same year was Resident Evil 0. In 2003, Eternal Darkness Sanity's Requiem was also released on the GameCube. This game is one of the first to use a mechanic called the Sanity Meter. This is something that we would see used more often in future horror games. The 6th generation was without a doubt the best time to be a horror fan. So many amazing horror games were released during this time. Games like The Suffering, Obscure, and Siren were all part of the greats, but the market itself was starting to become slightly oversaturated, and as a result, sales started to decline. After putting out 4 Silent Hill games, Team Silent ended up merging with Konami in 2005. While it seemed like a good move at the time, it turned into them losing control of the future of that IP. In fact, Konami would have very little involvement in the next few Silent Hill games, and this was only the beginning. That same year, Resident Evil 4 came out on both the GameCube and the PlayStation 2. This game was a huge success. Everyone loved it, from mainstream gamers to survival horror fans. There was just one small fucking problem. The game itself just wasn't scary. Like, at all. They even called it quits with using zombies. In its place, they used people infected with a virus that would basically just turn them into a slave with some genetic mutations. Hell, most of the attempted scares of the game were done through QuickTime events. Another game that came out that same year was Doom 3. Now, Doom games had always went more towards the quick-paced action combat rather than slow-paced horror, and the third installment was no exception. Right after that, Fear was released, and that was only slightly scarier than Doom 3, but again, it focused much more on combat. Both of these games were extremely successful. Looking at the sales figures of these games versus similar games that came out that year like Condemned, Criminal Origins, publishers soon decided that survival horror just wasn't lucrative enough to publish anymore. So at the beginning of the 7th generation, traditional survival horror games started to break off. First-party games that were based around horror elements would amp up the action to make them more marketable to mainstream gamers. A perfect example of this is 2006's Dead Rising, in which the goal of the game is focused more on killing as many zombies as possible rather than the storyline itself. Hell, sometimes the horror elements in these games were just thrown in for no fucking reason. Hell, a perfect example of this one is 2008's Call of Duty World at War, which had a hidden zombie wave survival game that was unlocked after you actually beat the game. Now, I'm not saying any of these were bad. In fact, both of these examples I really enjoyed playing, but for a survival horror fan like me, it felt like it was lacking something. Thankfully, some games tried to move past the action-based combat to bring us some genuinely horrifying experiences. 2007's BioShock filled some of this void for many gamers. The game contained so many great horror elements, and it was genuinely disturbing in some spots. The story and the atmosphere were both fucking amazing. The other really good scary game that came out in this era was 2008's Dead Space.
Alright everyone, we're here. Sinking our orbit now.
All this trouble over that chunk of rock.
Deep space mining is a lucrative business, Miss Daniels. Aegis 7 is a gold mine according to prospectors' reports. Cobalt, silicon, osmium. Now, where is she? There she is. We have visual contact.
While the first game is pretty creepy, the other two in the series again focus much more on the action side of things. Hell, the third game has a co-op element put in. While AAA publishers were shunning the very idea of survival horror games, indie developers are seeing a chance to break through and appeal to the horror audiences. Games like Amnesia: The Dark Descent, Slender, and DayZ have all brought us whole new forms of horror in the last 5 years. We have even had a whole new subgenre come out of indie horror games, simply called survival. And in the last 2 years or so, we've even seen AAA developers start to put some money into survival horror games again. Games like H1Z1, Alien Isolation, and Until Dawn are all very unique and interesting horror games that are made by these AAA developers. While the future of horror games is still very shaky at fucking best, these have been a glimmer of hope coming from the AAA studios. With all that said, we should tread very carefully. And look, whether it's an indie company or a AAA studio making a good horror game, I'm always happy just to get another good horror game. And I hope to see a shit ton of those in the future. Happy Halloween, you guys.